The stage was completely silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next act. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that grabs your chest and squeezes. The kind that makes 3,000 people forget to breathe. Nobody expected what was about to happen. Simon Cowell sat at the judge's table with his arms crossed, his expression already bored before the curtain even moved. He had seen everything in 20 years of this show. Prodigies. Legends. Disasters. Nothing surprised him anymore. He had made that very clear in interviews, in press conferences, in the cold way his eyes swept across every new act before they even opened their mouths. He glanced sideways at his fellow judges. They were scrolling phones, whispering, adjusting microphones. Nobody was paying attention. And then the curtain moved. A tall figure walked out onto that enormous stage. Thin. Young. Dressed simply in a white-collared shirt and dark trousers. No flashy outfit. No backup dancers. No dramatic entrance music. Just a young man walking alone into a spotlight so bright it looked like it was carved from heaven itself. The audience stirred. Someone near the front row whispered something to the person beside them. A ripple of murmuring moved through the crowd like wind through grass. Because people recognized him. Or thought they did. Or weren't sure, and that uncertainty made every single person in that arena sit up straighter. His name was announced. Barron. Simon finally looked up from the table. His pen stopped moving. He studied the young man standing at the center of the stage, this tall, calm, eerily composed figure who looked like he had never been nervous a day in his life, and something shifted in Simon's expression. Not warmth. Not welcome. Something harder to name. Something closer to curiosity mixed with suspicion. "What are you going to do for us today?" one of the judges asked. Barron looked out at the crowd. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there for a moment, as if listening to something the rest of the room couldn't hear. "Amazing grace," he said quietly. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Simon exhaled through his nose. Amazing grace. An old hymn. A church song. The kind of song that got performed at AGT roughly once every other season by someone who thought sincerity was a substitute for skill. He had heard it performed by choirs, by opera singers, by little girls in pigtails who made their grandmothers cry. He had never once been moved by it. He leaned back in his chair. "Whenever you're ready," Simon said flatly. And then Barron opened his mouth. What came out was not what anyone expected. It wasn't polished. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't the big, booming performance voice that usually filled an auditorium. It was something rawer than that. Something quieter and far more dangerous. A voice that didn't shout to be heard, a voice that simply was, in the way that rivers simply are, and mountains simply are, and grief simply is. The first note of Amazing Grace entered the room. And the room changed. It happened the way the most important things always happen, gradually, and then all at once. You could see it move across the audience like a wave. First the woman in the fourth row whose hand flew to her mouth. Then the man behind her whose eyes went wide and then immediately wet. Then the ripple spreading outward, row by row, section by section, until 3,000 people were sitting in a silence so loaded with emotion it felt almost unbearable. Simon Cowell's pen was on the table. His arms were no longer crossed. He was sitting forward, elbows on the desk, both hands folded against his mouth, his eyes locked on the young man at the center of the stage with an expression nobody in that room had seen on his face before. Not in 20 years. Not once. Barron sang on. He sang like someone who had known loss. Like someone who understood what grace actually meant, not as a pretty word in a hymn, but as a lifeline thrown to a drowning person in the dark. Every syllable landed with weight. Every pause between the lines was filled with something invisible and enormous that the audience felt in their bones rather than heard with their ears. By the third verse, people were crying openly. By the fourth, even the production crew in the wings had stopped moving. When the final note ended, it didn't so much stop as dissolve, hanging in the air above those 3,000 people for a long moment before fading into something that felt sacred. And then, nothing. 3 full seconds of absolute, total silence. And then the arena detonated. The standing ovation was instantaneous and thunderous. People were on their feet before the sound had even fully left the room. Screaming. Applauding. Some laughing through tears. Some just crying without embarrassment, without apology, without understanding why. Simon Cowell stood up slowly. He did not applaud immediately. He stood, and he looked at Barron across that enormous stage, and something passed between them, something unspoken and serious and real. Then Simon began to clap. Slowly at first. Then faster. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. He reached forward and pressed the golden buzzer. The gold confetti exploded from the ceiling. The lights blazed. The crowd went absolutely insane. And Barron Trump stood at the center of it all, looking up at the falling gold, eyes closed, lips barely curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but was something better, something that looked like peace. Simon leaned into his microphone. "I have been doing this show for longer than I care to admit," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "And I want to say something I have never said to anyone on this stage before." The arena went silent again. "That was not a performance," Simon said. "That was a moment. And there is a difference."